Hi, I'm Bradley Laporte, and for my framework, I chose school-wide positive behavioral interventions and support. To look it up, I use Gemini, which is Google's AI. First, let me define what PBIS is. What is PBIS? So PBIS is a three-tiered model of support that schools can implement to help students. There's three tiers. Tier 1 is your school-wide tier. It's for all students. You're going to see behavioral expectations clearly defined for all students, academic expectations clearly defined for all students. You're going to have data collected to monitor students and see how they're performing. And there's also going to be a lot of positive reinforcement implemented by teachers for students that are basically following the designated rules created for this tier. Tier 2 is targeted interventions. So this is more for students that are starting to fall behind. You might see small group interventions like test-taking groups or small study groups. You might have teachers having students check in with them during school to just make sure they're attending or maybe working on homework. The final tier is tier 3. That's where you get the intense interventions. This is for like the smallest amount of students, for the students that are really falling behind. You're going to see individualized behavior support plans based on like functional behavior assessments. You're also going to see like a lot of ABA kind of interventions used in this tier to help students get back on track. PBIS and how it applies to ABA, you're using database decision making, you're creating behavior intervention plans, you're using positive reinforcement. The overall goal of PBIS is to reduce classroom disruptions, promote student engagement, encourage students to self-regulate, and it's to provide extra support for students with behavioral or emotional needs, helping them succeed academically. So how can PBIS benefit a student with a culturally diverse background? Let's create an example student. Let's call him Steve. And let's say Steve comes from another country and is new to academics in the United States. Well, in PBIS with a three-tier system, Tier 1 would benefit Steve because at that tier, there is going to be clear expectations set for how Steve is supposed to behave academically and his behavior in class. There's also going to be a lot of positive reinforcement for Steve, so as he turns stuff turn homework in on time, and as he comes to class, he's going to get positive reinforcement for doing the right thing. If Steve starts to fall behind, Tier 2 can support Steve. They could do that by matching Steve with maybe another graduate student to work with him. Teachers can have Steve check in and check out with them to make sure that he's coming to class on time or coming to class and doing homework. Steve can also start getting active in small groups, small test-taking groups to help him with his skills. If Steve is still really struggling and he needs extra support, in Tier 3, the staff of the school can hold a meeting with Steve. They can include a counselor, and they can determine maybe there's issues like financial stress where they can get additional support to help Steve. The idea with the three-tier system in PBIS is that Steve won't get left behind. If he's not falling in line with the Tier 1 students, he'll eventually get support either in the Tier 2 or Tier 3. So for my research into PBIS, I looked at 4 separate articles. The first article is Using Student Voice to Improve School-Wide PBIS Implementation in Secondary Schools. And basically that article found that when students are more active in creating kind of the curriculum that's going to be implemented with PBIS, students are more active in implementing it, and more students will kind of follow the guidelines created in Tier 1. Article 2, Integration of Mental Health Interventions within PBIS, a Mixed Method Analysis by Araldi et al. 2023. Basically, that article found that schools fail to have a lot of mental health interventions in Tier 3, where it's most needed. They found most schools with high Tier 1 fidelity would offer some mental health interventions in Tier 2, but usually would fail to offer those in Tier 3 or not have a good Tier 3 program implemented. Article 3, School-wide PBIS, an example of applied behavior analysis, implemented at a scale of social importance. That's by Homer et al. 2015. That article looked at kind of the key things schools need to consider when implementing PBIS, and that's emphasizing core features, implementing support system, collecting and using data throughout the process, and prioritizing the implementation process of PBIS itself. The fourth and final article was a systematic review of Tier 1 PBIS implementations in high school by Estrapala et al. In 2021. And that just looked at how PBIS is implemented at Tier 1 and some of the struggles that they have. They noticed larger schools have more trouble implementing PBIS than smaller schools. I found Google Gemini to be beneficial to my research of PBIS. When I would enter it into the search engine, it would bring up information with direct references most of the time. Sometimes it did not, which gave me a pause because I'm not sure why that information wouldn't have a reference when other information did. Another thing I noticed is if I were to put an article in there and ask it to summarize it for me, it would sometimes summarize things not in the article, and it would also have like references to YouTube videos that have similar topics of the article but aren't direct information from the article itself. I find it to be a good guide, Google Gemini, to like kind of steer me in the right direction, but the information it provides I don't think is always accurate. Do I think PBIS is a good framework for schools? Yes. I definitely think it is a good framework for schools to utilize. I can see it easily being implemented in a college environment where students are seeing other students perform and receive positive reinforcement for their good work. My concern is based off some of the research where it seems like some of like the Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions aren't doing what they're supposed to be. I think it's very easy for schools to implement kind of broad rules for the general population, like in Tier 1, but the Tier 3 interventions, Tier 2 interventions, some schools might not be suitable to handle those kind of interventions. I think PBIS needs to have maybe professionals always involved for those higher level of interventions in Tier 3, just to make sure students are getting the support they need. Well, that's all I have. Thank you for watching my video on school-wide positive behavioral interventions and support.